An empire's greatest enemy was not an army, but time. For most ancient rulers, governing a vast territory meant living in a perpetual fog, where news from distant borders was always months out of date. Yet a handful of civilizations engineered a solution so brilliant it allowed them to think in real time. By the end of this exploration, you will see history's greatest empires not as collections of land, but as living, thinking organisms. We will uncover how messages crossed continents faster than thought possible, and discover why a simple knotted cord or a writer's tablet held more power than 1,000 soldiers. This journey reveals the true anatomy of power. What does it mean for a civilization to have a single, unified mind? To grasp their achievement, we must first unplug from our own world. For us, real time is instantaneous, a digital pulse measured in milliseconds. For an emperor, real time was a physical race against the sun. It was the absolute maximum velocity a human, a horse, or a beam of light could travel across the face of the earth. This was the hard ceiling of ancient speed, the fundamental limit every empire faced. Picture a routine dispatch from a frontier governor in Roman Britain, destined for the emperor's desk in Rome. Carried by a messenger on horseback, changing mounts at Imperial way stations, that scroll would still take over 3 weeks to arrive. For those 25 days, the situation on that frontier was a mystery to the central power. Or a harvest could fail, and Rome would remain blissfully unaware, operating on information that was already ancient history. This was the normal, agonizing pace of governance, a constant administrative lag. But for the empires that truly lasted, this normal pace was a fatal vulnerability. Speed was not about convenience, it was about survival. Consider the lifeblood of any state: taxation. A delayed report from a rich province meant delayed revenue, starving the treasury. A military command sent to a legion on the Danube would be based on a strategic picture that was months old by the time it was received. A local injustice could fester into a full-scale revolt if a petition for royal judgment took a year to reach the capital and return. An empire that moved at the speed of a walking courier was not a single entity. It was a loose patchwork of territories, each drifting on its own current, only tenuously connected to the center. The ruler was not governing in the present, he was constantly reacting to the past. This is why the creation of a specialized communication network was the single most important administrative project an ancient empire could undertake. It was the equivalent of installing a central nervous system. The goal was to collapse that administrative lag, to shrink weeks and months down to days, even hours. To create a channel where information could flow from the farthest fingertip of the realm to the brain of the state at the fastest speed physically possible on Earth. When that happened, something profound changed. The empire could begin to think in real time. It could sense a disturbance on a distant border almost as it happened, dispatch a remedy, and receive confirmation, all within a time frame that mattered. It could collect taxes efficiently, enforce laws uniformly, and project power predictably. The transition from a collection of provinces to a unified organism hinged entirely on this one capability. So, who were the first to build this nervous system, and what astonishing tools did they use to defy the very limits of their age? The answer arrived not with a legion, but with a lone rider on a lathered horse. Emperor Augustus, the first ruler of the Roman Empire, understood that conquest was only the beginning. The true challenge was making the sprawling new territory obey a single will. His solution was an engineering marvel of human logistics, the Cursus Publicus, the public course. This was not a postal service for the people. It was the exclusive information highway of the state, a physical internet built with stone, horseflesh, and relentless imperial discipline. Augustus transformed the patchwork of roads and informal messengers from the Republican era into a single, standardized system owned and operated entirely by the government. His goal was absolute control over the flow of information, ensuring that his commands reached the edges of the world faster than any rumor of rebellion could travel back. The genius of the system was in its infrastructure, a repetitive, reliable pulse along every major road. Picture the Great Via Appia stretching south from Rome, or the Via Augusta winding through Hispania. At intervals of roughly 6 to 8 miles, a rider would find a mutatio, a way station. This was a simple relay post, little more than a stable and a fresh team of horses, staffed by attendants whose sole purpose was to swap out exhausted animals in minutes. Every 20 to 25 miles, a larger complex called a mansio provided an overnight rest stop with lodging, food, and repair facilities for the official couriers and their carriages. This network of stations was the beating heart of the operation, allowing a message to move day and night without stopping. The messengers themselves, the veridarii, were the lifeblood flowing through these veins. They carried the most urgent dispatches in leather satchels, changing horses at every mutatio but continuing on themselves for as long as they could endure. For less time-sensitive but bulkier cargo, like tax records or official personnel, horse-drawn carts called ready would ply the routes. The average speed was staggering for the ancient world, around 50 Roman miles per day. A critical report from a governor in Londinium could be in the emperor's hands in Rome in just over a week, a journey that would take a normal traveler more than a month. This velocity transformed the nature of power. An edict issued from the Palatine Hill could be read aloud in the forums of Gaul or North Africa, while the ink was still practically fresh, creating a powerful illusion of the emperor's omnipresent authority. But the Cursus Publicus carried more than just orders. It was a two-way stream of intelligence, a constant sensory feed to the imperial brain. Census data detailing population and wealth flowed in from the provinces, allowing for precise taxation. Military intelligence from frontier legions informed strategic decisions. Petitions for justice could be delivered with unprecedented speed, helping to maintain the perception of Roman law and order. The system bound the empire together not with chains but with information, creating a cohesive administrative reality that had simply never existed before. It allowed Rome to think, react, and govern across continental distances, making the empire feel less like a collection of conquered lands and more like a single, vast organism with a remarkably quick set of reflexes. Yet for all its sophistication, this network had one profound limitation. It required a monumental, fixed investment of stone and timber, a permanent footprint on the landscape that could not be easily moved. What happened when an empire needed to think in real time across landscapes where building roads was impossible, across mountains and deserts that defied Roman engineering? Another civilization high in the clouds discovered a far more elegant and utterly silent solution. The true power of the Roman system pulsed not through the stones but through the people. A message was only as fast as the weakest link in a human chain that stretched for thousands of miles. At the heart of this chain was the imperial courier, the Veridarius. He was often a soldier chosen for his endurance and loyalty, or sometimes an imperial slave whose entire world was the road. His most precious possession was not the scroll in his satchel, but his diploma, a certificate of authority issued directly by the emperor or a high official. This small, sealed document was his passport, granting him the absolute right to demand a fresh horse at any relay station and to requisition food and lodging. Without it, he was just another traveler. With it, he became an extension of the emperor's own will, and all traffic was required to clear the road for him. His life was one of brutal, relentless motion. Imagine the physical toll, riding for hours at a gallop on unpaved roads in all weather, day and night. He would thunder into a mutatio, the way station, leap from his sweating, exhausted mount, and onto a fresh one in a matter of minutes, all while the station attendants secured his satchel. There was no time for rest, only a quick drink before he was back in the saddle, pushing onward until he could no longer stay awake, at which point he might hand the dispatch to a fresh rider at a mancio. The message moved forward like a baton in a race that never ended, but the courier depended entirely on the man who made his speed possible, the station master. This was a position of immense responsibility and profound isolation. Stationed at a remote outpost along a lonely stretch of road, his duty was to keep the relay alive. He was a quartermaster, a stable manager, and a security officer all in one. His success was measured in mundane, vital details. Did he have enough healthy, strong horses ready at all times? Was there sufficient fodder, grain, and water stocked for animals and men? Could he repair a damaged cartwheel or a broken harness immediately? The logistics were staggering. A single major route required hundreds of horses, each needing care and rotation. A breakdown at one station, from illness, banditry, or simple mismanagement, could create a bottleneck that slowed Imperial communications for days, breaking the sacred continuity of the sprint. The entire enterprise was a masterpiece of synchronized human effort. It began with the scribe in a governor's office, carefully drafting the dispatch. It passed to the official who sealed it and logged its departure. Then it flew through the hands of countless unsung individuals, the stable boys who saddled the horses, the cooks who prepared a quick meal, the guards who kept the station safe. Every person in this chain had to perform their small, critical task perfectly, with military precision. Their coordinated effort transformed what should have been a slow, linear journey for one man into a seamless, continuous sprint performed by many. The Empire's thoughts traveled so fast because an army of anonymous specialists made the path frictionless. Yet this system, for all its coordination, still relied on a tangible object, a physical scroll or tablet to carry its words. What if you could send a complex message without sending any object at all? What if the Empire's nervous system could operate in complete silence across impossible terrain, using nothing but knots in a string? While Rome's messengers thundered down paved roads, the Mongols faced an entirely different geography, a sea of grass where fixed paths were meaningless. Their empire was not a territory but a motion. To govern a realm that stretched from the Pacific to the Danube, they needed a communication system as fluid and relentless as their cavalry. The result was the Yam, a network that turned the vast, empty steppe into a highway. A Yam station was not a grand stone building, but a strategic outpost of survival. Spaced roughly a day's ride apart, these stations were oases of readiness in a landscape of sheer endurance. Each one was stocked with the essentials for relentless travel: fresh horses, food, fodder, and basic shelter. But the true genius was in their specialization. On the open plains, a station held only the fastest mounts. In forested or muddy regions, others kept oxen to pull couriers in carts. Where rivers cut across the route, stations held boats and crews, seamlessly switching the message from land to water. This was logistics stripped to its purest form, a system designed for one purpose: to move information at the maximum speed the environment would allow. The courier was the soul of this machine, clad for the saddle and identified by his most important possession, the Paiza. This was not a paper scroll, but a tablet of authority, often made of silver or gold for the most urgent messengers. Bearing the seal of the Great Khan, it commanded absolute obedience. Presenting the Paiza at a station meant instant service, a fresh horse, a meal, and the right to demand assistance from any subject of the empire. With this authority, the courier performed a feat of endurance that defied belief. By changing horses every few hours at each successive yam, he could ride without stopping for sleep. His message flew ahead of him, carried on a chain of lathered horses and determined men. This allowed a single dispatch to cover over 200 miles in a single day, a speed that would have been pure fantasy in any other contemporary empire. The effect on governance was transformative. A report from a general on the Russian frontier could reach the court of the Great Khan in Karakoram in a matter of weeks, not months. Intelligence about a rebellion, a harvest, or a diplomatic overture moved with a swiftness that made the colossal empire feel intimate to its rulers. The Yam system was the central nervous system of a nomadic superstate, allowing the mind in Mongolia to feel a disturbance in Persia or Hungary almost as it happened. It created a political reality where distance was measured in days, not miles, enabling a level of coordinated action across continents that the world had never seen. But both the Roman and Mongol systems shared a core vulnerability. They were built on trust and imperial control. The message itself was a physical object, a scroll or a tablet, carried by a man whose loyalty had to be absolute. What if you needed a system that was not just fast but inherently secure? What if you could design a language for the state that was impossible to intercept or forge? A code woven not on parchment, but into the very fabric of the empire. A gold Paiza was not just a pass, it was a command. In the Mongol communication web, the physical object carried by the courier was the system's ultimate safeguard. Unlike a wax-sealed scroll that could be broken and read, the Paiza was a badge of office, impossible to forge and instantly recognizable. Crafted from iron, silver, or the highest authority, gold, its material broadcast the message priority before a single word was spoken. A courier bearing a gold tablet could requisition not just the best horse at a station, but could demand food, shelter, and assistance from any person or community he encountered. The object itself compelled obedience, transforming a lone rider into the direct physical extension of the Great Khan's will. This solved a critical problem of trust across thousands of miles. A local chieftain might not know the courier's face, but he could not dispute the authority of the officially stamped Paiza. Its very design, often inscribed with specific symbols or text, made counterfeiting unthinkable and dangerous, ensuring the chain of command remained pure and uncorrupted from the capital to the farthest frontier. For the most urgent dispatches, the symbolism grew even more potent. Some messengers carried a jerej, a notched tally that would match a counterpart held at the destination, a physical key proving authenticity. And in certain traditions, a courier might present an arrow. This was no weapon but a supreme symbol of unbreakable command. An arrow travels in one direction, fast and true, and cannot be called back. To receive the Khan's arrow was to receive an order that admitted no delay, no debate, and no failure. It mobilized not just the Yam station but entire villages. Seeing this symbol, communities knew they were required to provide whatever the messenger needed, men, supplies, or guides, to see the imperial word on its way. This fusion of profound symbolic authority with ruthless logistical planning created something remarkable. The Mongol communication web was not a rigid, static structure like a Roman road. It was a living, pulsing network that could flex and intensify with the empire's needs. A gold Paiza or an arrow could suddenly prioritize one stream of information over all others, creating a fast lane for the empire's most critical thoughts across the continental expanse. Yet this system, for all its speed and symbolic power, still relied on a human intermediary to speak the message. What if you could design a system where the message itself was the medium? A language that required no translation and could be read by anyone in the empire, regardless of what tongue they spoke. High in the Andes, an empire thought with its feet. Where the Romans built roads for wheels and the Mongols mastered the horse, the Inca faced a world of vertical extremes. Their realm was a tapestry of deep valleys and soaring peaks where conventional transport simply did not exist. Their solution was a network powered not by horsepower, but by the most reliable engine available, the human heart and lung. They created the Chasqui, the fleet-footed messengers who turned the mountains into a highway of breath and sinew. These were not ordinary couriers. Chasquis were selected as boys, trained for years in endurance, memory, and sprinting at altitude. They were stationed in pairs in small, stone-built way stations called tambos, which dotted the magnificent Inca road, the Quipu, every 3 to 5 miles. This distance was precisely calculated, the maximum a runner could cover at a full sprint before his wind gave out. The system operated on a principle of seamless vocal relay. A runner approaching a tambo would begin shouting his message while still dozens of yards away. The waiting runner, already listening intently, would hear the words, repeat them to confirm, and then turn and sprint to the next tambo where the process began again. This created a living, breathing chain of sound, where a verbal command could flow across hundreds of miles without ever slowing to a walk. It was a stunning feat of logistical synchronization, turning the empire's rugged spine into a single, continuous vocal cord. But spoken words could be forgotten or garbled in the thin mountain air. For the complex data that sustained a civilization, the Inca developed a technology of astonishing elegance, the Quipu. This was not a written script, but a tactile, three-dimensional language made of colored chords and knots. A quipu consisted of a main chord from which dozens of pendant strings hung. The colors of the strings, the types of knots, their positions, and even the spin of the yarn held specific meanings. Through this system, a quipu kamayok, a keeper of the knots, could record vast amounts of information. They could account for the contents of imperial storehouses, tracking thousands of bushels of maize or llama herds. They could document census data, tax obligations, and military logistics. Some researchers believe certain quipus may have encoded narratives, histories, or even ceremonial poetry, transforming them from mere accounting tools into a genuine medium of cultural memory. The combination was transformative. A Chasqui runner sprinting from tambo to tambo could carry both a shouted alert and a physical quipu. The spoken message provided immediate, urgent news, perhaps of a disturbance in a distant province. The quipu he carried provided the cold, hard data needed to respond, the exact numbers of available soldiers in nearby garrisons or the grain reserves in local storehouses. This allowed the Sopa Inca, the divine ruler in the capital of Cusco, to govern with a precision that defied geography. He could know not just that a harvest had failed, but exactly how many households were affected and how much surplus grain existed in the nearest mountain granary to relieve them. He could deploy troops based on real-time counts of warriors and their supplies, all encoded in a bundle of strings that traveled swiftly in a runner's hand. This was an empire that thought in knots and breath, a civilization that mapped its entire administrative reality onto a portable mnemonic code and then sprinted that code across the roof of the world. It allowed them to integrate a vast, vertical empire of diverse climates and peoples into a cohesive, responsive whole. Yet this system, for all its ingenuity, shared the ultimate vulnerability of every network we have seen. It required a centralized authority to maintain the tambos, train the runners, and interpret the quipus. The knowledge was held by a specialized class. When that center collapsed, the network fell silent, and the language of the knots became a mystery. This reveals a profound truth about these ancient systems. They were not just tools of control, but fragile ecosystems of shared knowledge. Their real-time capability lasted only as long as the civilization that breathed life into them. So what happened when the center could no longer hold? How did the collapse of an empire's mind lead to the unraveling of its very body? The speed of a courier's horse meant nothing without a path for it to run. These empires did not simply use the landscape, they rewrote it with stone and rope, transforming wilderness into engineered channels for thought. The physical pathway was the first and most fundamental layer of any communication network, a massive cognitive investment carved directly into the earth. Each civilization approached this challenge according to its own geography and genius, building not roads but literal extensions of the imperial mind. The Roman vision was one of geometric order imposed upon chaos. Their engineers were obsessed with the straight line, a direct reflection of their administrative philosophy. A Roman road was not meant to meander around a hill, it was meant to go through it. If a swamp lay in the path, they drained it and built a raised causeway. If a river blocked the way, they spanned it with a stone bridge of such durability that many still stand today. The goal was all-weather, all-season reliability. The construction was a marvel of layered engineering, starting with a deep trench filled with large stones for drainage, then layers of gravel, sand, and finally a surface of fitted paving stones cambered to shed rainwater. This created a highway that could support the relentless pounding of military columns and courier carts alike, turning spring mud and autumn floods from impassable barriers into minor inconveniences. These roads were state projects built and maintained by the legions, and they served a dual purpose. They accelerated commerce, but their primary function was to accelerate command. A straight, paved road from Rome to a frontier fortress minimized the variable of terrain, turning travel time from an uncertainty into a calculable equation for the imperial strategists. In the Andes, the Inca faced an engineering puzzle of verticality. Their solution was the Quipu, the royal road, a network that made a mockery of altitude. Where Romans built over, the Inca built with. Their pathways followed the brutal logic of the mountains, ascending slopes via masterfully crafted stone staircases that seemed to climb into the clouds. They cut tunnels through solid rock and built retaining walls to prevent landslides. Their most breathtaking innovations were the bridges. Across deep ravines, they constructed suspension bridges from a material that seems impossibly fragile, woven grass fibers. Yet these cables, renewed annually by local communities as part of their labor obligation, were incredibly strong. A bridge of Iku grass could span over 100 feet and support the weight of a column of soldiers or a sprinting Chasqui. This network was not about straight lines, it was about creating the most efficient possible line through a world of sheer cliffs and dizzying drops. Every stone step and swaying bridge was a calculated investment to keep the runners moving, to ensure the voice of the Sapa Inca never echoed against a dead end. The Mongol approach was different, yet no less deliberate. As a nomadic power, they did not pave continents with stone. Their empire was the steppe, and their natural road was the open grassland. Yet even they understood the necessity of curated pathways. They maintained and secured key routes through mountain passes, river fords, and desert oases, the critical choke points that connected their vast domains. They would clear these routes of bandits and ensure local leaders kept them open for official traffic. For the Mongols, the infrastructure was less about permanent construction and more about enforced mobility, guaranteeing that the Yam rider with his golden Paiza would never find his way blocked by anything but the weather itself. In each case, from the paved Roman via to the grassy Mongol trail, the pathway was never an accident. It was a deliberate, state-funded project to shrink the world, to turn the empire's geography from a source of delay into a conduit for speed. These were the durable synapses along which the empire's urgent thoughts would forever race. The messages that flew along these imperial nerves were the thoughts of the state itself. They fell into a few critical categories, each one vital for keeping the vast organism alive and aware. The most urgent of all was military intelligence. This was the empire's fight or flight reflex. A scout's report of a barbarian host massing beyond the Rhine had to sprint to Rome. News of a successful battle or a devastating loss shaped the next strategic move. A rumor of rebellion in a distant province could not be allowed to simmer. It had to be reported instantly so the central authority could decide whether to send an emissary or a legion. These messages carried the empire's immediate survival in their words, and the networks were built to prioritize their speed above all else. Almost as critical were the steady pulses of administrative command. These were the routine thoughts that governed daily life across millions of people. They included the annual tax quotas, meticulously calculated demands for grain, silver, or textiles from each province. They carried judicial rulings from the emperor or his highest judges, setting legal precedents and resolving disputes that local governors could not. They announced the appointment or recall of provincial governors, the men whose hands wielded imperial power on the ground. This constant flow of orders and data was what turned conquest into governance, transforming raw territory into a functioning, taxable, obedient part of the whole. Without this stream, the empire's body would have been a collection of unfeeling, unresponsive limbs. Then there was the general news, the sensory input about the health of the realm. Reports on the harvest were economic data in its purest form. A good yield meant stability. A poor one meant potential famine and unrest, requiring the redistribution of grain from imperial storehouses. News of a natural disaster, an earthquake or a flood, triggered the state's capacity for relief and repair. Even the health of important figures, like a provincial governor falling ill, was essential intelligence as it could signal a coming power vacuum. This category of message allowed the empire to monitor its own metabolism, to sense internal shifts and stresses long before they became critical failures. Finally, there was a category of communication that was entirely symbolic, yet carried immense power. This was the movement of the emperor himself, or of sacred objects that represented his authority. The announcement of an imperial progress, a journey by the ruler to visit a province, was not just travel news. It was a massive administrative event that mobilized entire regions to prepare. The transport of a revered standard or a holy relic from the capital to a frontier temple was a deliberate act of political and spiritual bonding, a way to make the distant feel the presence of the center. These movements were messages in themselves, broadcasting loyalty, piety, and unity without a single written order. By looking at what traveled these roads and runners' paths, we see their true purpose. They were not mere mail services. They were the channels for the data streams that fed a collective consciousness. Military intelligence was the empire's sense of touch and threat detection. Administrative orders were its conscious commands to its own body. General news was its internal sense of well-being, and symbolic movement was its method of reinforcing its own identity. Every knot on a quipu, every sealed scroll in a courier's satchel, was a piece of information flowing toward a central point where it could be synthesized into understanding and then into action. This was how an empire thought, by constantly gathering the world into its mind, processing it, and sending its will back out with breathtaking speed. Speed created a new and dangerous vulnerability, interception. An empire's most urgent thought, racing across an open road or a lonely mountain pass, was a tantalizing prize. For a rival, a rebel, or a simple bandit, capturing a courier was like seizing a piece of the imperial mind itself. This constant threat forced every civilization to become an early cryptographer, inventing ways to armor their words without slowing their journey. The Roman solution was a blend of legal terror and physical security. A state dispatch was sealed with the official wax imprint of the sending authority, often the emperor's own signet ring. This small disk of wax was more than a lock, it was a legal boundary. To break the seal of an imperial message without authorization was not just theft, it was treason, a capital offense punishable by death. The seal created a chain of custody. Anyone who handled the scroll could see if it had been tampered with, making the act of interception far riskier. The courier himself was part of this security apparatus. He was often a soldier or a trusted imperial slave, a man whose loyalty was beyond question because his life depended on it. His very identity was his credential, and the punishment for failing in his duty was severe. This system relied on a foundation of fear and institutional trust, protecting the message by making the consequences of its compromise terrifyingly clear. For the Mongols, security was baked into the symbols of authority. The Paiza, the tablet of command, was itself a secure device. Its material, gold or silver, and its specific inscriptions were nearly impossible to forge. A local chieftain presented with a gold Paiza did not need to know the courier. He only needed to recognize the unimpeachable authority of the object. This bypassed the need for personal trust over vast distances. The message might be oral or written, but its authenticity and priority were guaranteed by the physical token that compelled obedience. The security lay in the system's exclusivity. Only a rider bearing this specific symbol could command the resources of the Yam, making impersonation the greatest crime against the state's communication web. The Inca faced a unique security challenge. Their Chasqui system, with its shouted relays, was brilliantly fast but inherently public. A message yelled from one runner to the next could potentially be overheard by anyone near the tambo. This vulnerability may have been a key reason for the profound development of the Quipu. While a spoken order could be intercepted, the knotted cord was a locked box. Its complex language of colors, knots, and positions was a true cipher, a code known only to the Quipukamayaks, the trained record keepers. A rebel could capture a runner and hear his shouted words, but without a trained interpreter, the Quipu in his hand was just a bundle of strings. The empire's most sensitive data, its tax records, its resource inventories, its strategic logistics, were all safeguarded within this tactile, three-dimensional code. This represents perhaps the earliest state-level use of a cryptographic system where the medium itself was the encryption. Across these methods, we see the ancient struggle between speed and security. A sealed scroll could be opened. A trusted courier could be bribed or ambushed. A shouted message could be overheard. The constant pressure of espionage and rebellion drove innovation in secrecy, from the legal force of a wax seal to the mathematical complexity of knotted cords. Empires were not just building networks to think faster, they were engineering ways to think in private, to ensure their most critical conversations reached only the intended ears. This arms race of ancient information security reveals a timeless truth. The more connected a society becomes, the more desperately it must learn to protect the thoughts that flow through its connections. This relentless speed came at a staggering price. Building and maintaining an empire's nervous system was perhaps the single greatest ongoing expense a pre-modern state could face. It was a financial and human investment so vast that it fundamentally reshaped the entire economy around its needs. The gold for a Mongol Paiza, the stone for a Roman bridge, the grain for 1,000 relay horses, none of it appeared by magic. This infrastructure was funded through two relentless channels, the central treasury and the sweat of local communities. In Rome, the Cursus Publicus was a notorious drain on provincial budgets. While the emperor in Rome might issue the orders, the actual cost of building the mansions and mutations, of stocking them with horses, fodder, and stable hands, fell heavily on the provinces themselves. Local governors were expected to fund these operations from their regional tax revenues, a burden that often led to resentment and creative accounting. Communities along the routes faced the Angaria, the compulsory obligation to provide animals, carts, and supplies for passing officials. A town could be bankrupted by the sudden arrival of an imperial entourage claiming its right to food, lodging, and transport. The system meant to bind the empire together could also strain it to the breaking point, as the cost of maintaining the flow of information was extracted directly from the people it was meant to control. The Mongol Yam operated on a similar principle of decentralized cost. The Great Khan commanded the network, but its physical sustenance was requisitioned from the land it crossed. Local populations were required by law to provide the horses, the guides, the food, and the labor to keep the stations running. This was not a salaried bureaucracy. It was a form of taxation paid in kind and in service. A herder on the steppe might see his best horses taken for the yam. A farming village might have its grain stores tapped to feed the couriers. The system's incredible speed was built on this ability to instantly mobilize the resources of subject peoples, making the entire empire pay for the privilege of its own swift governance. Perhaps the most explicit link between communication and cost was the Inca mitre. This was not a tax of money or goods, but a labor tax, a required period of service owed to the state. Every household across Tawantinsuyu, you owed a certain number of days each year working on state projects, and a primary use of this mitre labor was the maintenance of the empire's circulatory system. Communities were assigned the duty of building and repairing their section of the Quipu Nyan. They wove the grass cables for the great suspension bridges, renewing them annually in a sacred, practical ritual. They stocked the tambos with supplies and provided the young men who would train as Chasqui runners. The entire network, from the mountain staircases to the runners themselves, was built and sustained by the collective labor of the very people it connected. This immense investment reveals a profound historical truth. The ability to think in real time was not a side effect of power, it was the core reason for it. States collected taxes and demanded labor primarily to fund this capability. The treasury was not just a piggy bank for palaces and armies, it was the operating budget for a continental nervous system. The grain taken from a farmer, the days of labor owed by a villager, these were the calories that fed the empire's brain, allowing it to perceive, to decide, and to command across impossible distances. This premium service was what separated a true empire from a mere kingdom. It was the ultimate competitive advantage, and its astronomical cost meant only the most ruthless, organized, and wealthy states could afford to play the game. Even the most brilliant nervous system could be severed. For all their speed and security, these imperial networks were not invincible, but fragile webs of trust and logistics stretched impossibly thin. Their collapse rarely came from a single blow, but from a slow unraveling of the very threads that held them together. The most obvious threat was physical destruction. An invading army knew that to cripple an empire, you did not just attack its soldiers, you targeted its ability to think. Burning a chain of yam stations across the steppe, or sabotaging the stone bridges of the Quipu Nyan in the mountains, instantly plunged a region into informational darkness. A natural disaster could achieve the same result overnight. An earthquake might topple a crucial series of tambos, or a flood could wash away a Roman causeway, creating a gap in the imperial reflex that could take months to repair. In that silence, local governors or tribal leaders, suddenly cut off from the stream of commands and reports, were forced to make their own decisions. They began to think for themselves, and with that local thinking came the first steps toward a separate identity. More insidious than invasion, however, was internal decay. Corruption was a parasite that fed on the system's lifeblood. A station master along the Cursus Publicus might embezzle the funds meant for fodder, leaving the relay horses underfed and slow. A courier with a golden Paiza could misuse his absolute authority, commandeering resources for personal gain or extorting local villagers, undermining the very loyalty the network was meant to inspire. This rot from within was hard to detect from a distant capital, and it eroded efficiency one stolen coin, one underfed horse at a time. The later Roman Empire suffered from a different kind of systemic sickness, bureaucratic inertia. The once exclusive imperial courier service became overloaded with privileged users, senators, bishops, and wealthy merchants who all demanded the right to use the state's infrastructure for their own purposes. The roads became clogged, the stations overwhelmed, and the urgent military dispatches that were the system's original purpose found themselves stuck in traffic. Speed gave way to delay, and the empire's thoughts grew sluggish and confused. When the network finally failed, the effect was not merely an inconvenience. It was a fundamental cognitive breakdown. Provinces that had once functioned as responsive limbs of a single body now drifted into isolation. Without the constant pulse of administrative orders, tax collection faltered. Without the swift arrival of military intelligence, local legions or garrisons became isolated outposts, vulnerable and unsure. The shared reality that the communication system had painstakingly constructed, the sense of being part of a unified whole, simply evaporated. What remained were fragments, each operating on old information and local priorities. The collapse of the network did not just accompany the fall of an empire, it actively caused it by dissolving the connective tissue that made an empire possible in the first place. The mind went silent, and the body, no longer receiving coherent instructions, began to fall apart. This reveals the ultimate paradox of these ancient systems. Their greatest strength was also their most profound vulnerability. They centralized knowledge and power to an extraordinary degree, but in doing so, they made the entire civilization dependent on the health of a single, intricate, and terribly fragile chain. Each system was a masterpiece of adaptation, a direct reflection of the world it had to conquer. To understand their true genius, we must place them side by side and ask not which was best, but which was fastest, which spanned the most impossible ground, and which built the deepest framework of law around its messengers. In a pure race across open land, the Mongol Yam stands almost unchallenged. Their network of elite riders on specialized horses, swapping mounts every few hours without ever stopping to sleep, could achieve speeds that defied the ancient world. A dispatch could cover over 200 miles in a single day, a rate that turned the Eurasian steppe into a blur beneath the hooves of the Khan's will. This was raw velocity, the ultimate expression of nomadic mobility harnessed for a single purpose, closing the continental information gap with breathtaking haste. For sheer triumph over geography, however, the Inca Chasqui system is unparalleled. Where the Mongols had the endless steppe, the Inca had the vertical world of the Andes. Their solution was not the horse, which could not navigate their stone staircases, but the human body trained to its absolute limit. By spacing their tambos a sprint apart and using a vocal relay, they turned mountain ranges into a highway of breath and sound. They conquered terrain that would have stopped any wheeled cart or cavalry unit dead in its tracks. Their network was not the fastest in absolute terms, but it was the most resilient in the face of nature's most formidable obstacles, proving that an empire's thoughts could flow uphill. In terms of bureaucratic and legal sophistication, the Roman Cursus Publicus set a standard that would echo for centuries. This was not just a relay system, it was an institution woven into the fabric of Roman law and administration. Its operators, from the courier with his diploma to the station master accountable for his horses, were part of a formal hierarchy. The use of the system was strictly regulated by imperial decree, and its maintenance was a line item in the provincial budget. The Romans built a permanent, state-owned infrastructure of stone roads and way stations, creating a predictable, all-weather channel for governance. Their genius was in turning communication into a civil engineering project and a legal framework, making the movement of information as orderly as the movement of a legion. This side-by-side view reveals a profound truth. The wheel, the horse, the human foot, these were not just tools, they were technological constraints that shaped entire civilizations. The Romans had the wheel and paved roads to support it, so their system was built on carts and carriages. The Mongols had the horse and the open plain, so their system optimized for the mounted rider. The Inca, lacking the wheel and suitable terrain for horses, reached the pinnacle of foot-based logistics. Each empire looked at the world it inhabited, assessed the tools at its disposal, and engineered a radically different solution to the same existential problem. They all sought to collapse distance and time, to create a unified mind from a scattered body, but the paths they carved to reach that goal were as distinct as the continents they ruled. This diversity of innovation shows us that the drive to connect, to know, and to command is a universal force, one that will bend the very landscape to its will, whether with paved stone, woven grass, or the pounding rhythm of a runner's heart on a mountain path. The story of imperial communication is far wider than three famous names. Across the ancient world, the same urgent need sparked remarkably similar inventions. Centuries before Roman legions paved their first mile, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius I had already engineered a continental artery. Historians like Herodotus marveled at the Royal Road, a meticulously maintained highway stretching over 1,500 miles from the imperial heart in Susa to the distant shores of the Aegean Sea. Its true power lay not in the dirt and stone, but in the 111 posting stations placed along its length. At each of these way stations, a royal messenger would find a fresh horse and provisions, allowing an urgent dispatch to complete the entire grueling journey in just 7 days. For a traveler on foot, the same trek would take 3 months. This system transformed a vast, multicultural empire of disparate lands into a coherent unit, enabling tax revenues, military orders, and intelligence to flow with a regularity that stunned the ancient world and set a template others would follow for a millennium. Half a world away, the bureaucratic genius of Imperial China refined the concept to an art form. Dynasties like the Tang, ruling from the 7th to the 10th centuries, constructed an elaborate grid of official roads and courier stations that bound their territory together. This was not a single road, but an entire administrative ecosystem. The system was so thorough that it was governed by its own detailed legal codes, specifying everything from the types of horses to be kept at mountain stations versus plain stations, to the exact punishments for a station master who failed to have a fresh mount ready. Chinese couriers carried not just scrolls, but tallies and seals that created an unbreakable chain of accountability for every message. When the Mongol conquerors later established the Yuan dynasty in China, they did not impose a completely foreign system. They absorbed and adapted the sophisticated Chinese postal network, supercharging it with their own relentless demand for speed to create the legendary Yam. This cultural borrowing reveals a critical truth: the technology of real-time governance was contagious. From the Persian plains to the Chinese heartland, the pattern repeats itself. Any state that grew beyond the horizon of a single city needed to solve the same puzzle of distance. The solutions they crafted, whether royal roads, relay stations, or coded tallies, were among humanity's first great leaps in information technology. They proved that the impulse to connect, to know, and to command from a center was a near-universal driver of political innovation. These networks were the operating systems upon which empires ran, and their echoes can still be felt. But what is the legacy of these vanished systems in our own hyper-connected age? Do the stone roads and runners' paths of antiquity have anything to teach us about the digital networks that now pulse around the globe? A governor contemplating rebellion faced a new and terrifying calculation. It was no longer a question of whether the emperor would find out, but how soon. The relentless speed of the imperial courier transformed the psychological landscape of power. Across the vastness of an empire, the state engineered something far more potent than fast mail. It crafted an illusion of omnipresence. The ruler, physically confined to a palace in a single city, could now project his authority into every corner of his realm with a perceived immediacy that felt supernatural. This was the network's most brilliant achievement. It colonized the minds of those it connected. For the local administrator in a distant province, the knowledge that his report would be on the emperor's desk within a week fundamentally changed his behavior. He understood that any act of disloyalty, any misappropriation of funds, or any failure to quell unrest would be met not with a delayed, ponderous response, but with a swift and certain reckoning. The lag time that once provided a buffer for independent action had vanished. The state was no longer a distant, slow-moving entity. It was a watchful presence operating just over the horizon of time. This constant potential for immediate feedback created a powerful internal discipline, a self-policing mechanism woven into the fabric of governance itself. The system made the risk of disobedience feel imminent and therefore irrational. For the ordinary subject, the effect was more subtle but no less profound. The imperial messenger was a living symbol, a recurring spectacle of state power integrated into daily life. A farmer tilling his field would see the courier thunder passed on the paved Roman road, a blur of focused energy. A trader on the Inca trail would step aside for the sprinting Chasqui, hearing his shouted message echo against the stone mountainsides. These were not rare events, they were routine. This regular, visible proof of the system in operation served as a continuous reminder. It whispered that the central authority was active, connected, and capable of reaching into their very locale at a moment's notice. The distant emperor became an immediate psychological fact. His laws were not abstract concepts from a far-off land. They were commandments delivered by the breathless runner who had just passed through the village. His tax demands were not negotiable requests. They were precise figures recorded on a quipu that was even now racing toward the provincial storehouse. The network made the abstract concrete, transforming the idea of empire into a sensory experience of sound, sight, and motion. This carefully cultivated perception shrank the empire conceptually. The daunting physical distances between province and capital were mentally compressed by the speed of information. A crisis on the Danube felt closer to Rome because the news arrived so quickly. A harvest in the Andes felt more relevant to Cusco because the data was so immediate. This shared, accelerated timeline fostered a fragile sense of unity. Different regions speaking different languages and living different lives were nonetheless operating on the same administrative clock, responding to the same urgent pulses from the center. They were participants, however unwilling, in a single, synchronized system. The illusion of omnipresence thus achieved two monumental feats. It deterred rebellion through the psychology of imminent consequence, and it fostered compliance by making central authority a daily, undeniable reality. The empire's control was no longer based solely on the threat of legions over the hill, but on the deeper, more pervasive understanding that the hill itself was within the constant reach of the imperial mind. This was the ultimate triumph of the network. It convinced millions of people across continents that they were being watched, heard, and governed in the present tense, binding them to a rhythm of obedience that felt as inevitable as the rising sun. But the steady pulse of the courier was too slow for a true emergency. For a threat that demanded an instant, empire-wide flinch, rulers turned to a different class of technology, the language of light and flight. These were the ancillary signal systems, the empire's instinctual reflexes, designed not for governance but for instantaneous alarm. When a detailed report was impossible, speed was everything. The most ancient and widespread of these rapid alerts was the fire beacon. This was communication stripped to its purest form, a single, blazing bit of information visible across dozens of miles. The Byzantine Empire perfected this into a sophisticated early warning grid against naval invasion. A chain of towers was constructed across the Anatolian peninsula, each within clear sight of the next. The signal was brutally simple, the presence or absence of fire. The lighting of a beacon in a coastal tower meant enemy ships had been sighted. The next tower in line would see the flame and ignite its own, triggering a wave of fire that could race from the frontier to the capital of Constantinople in under an hour. This was not a message with details. It did not say how many ships or what type. It screamed only one word, here. Yet that single bit of data, transmitted at the speed of light, could mobilize entire provinces and ready the capital's defenses long before the first enemy sail crested the horizon. It was the Empire's autonomic nervous response, a flash of pure awareness that bypassed the slower, thinking pathways of the courier network. For a more targeted, one-way alert from a specific remote point, empires harnessed nature's own navigators, the carrier pigeon. This practice dates back to antiquity, with evidence of its use in ancient Mesopotamia, Persia, and Rome. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Pigeons possess a powerful homing instinct, an ability to return to their roost over astonishing distances. A military commander on campaign would take pigeons from their home loft with him. If he needed to send an urgent, unrepeatable message back to headquarters, he would write a tiny note, attach it to the bird's leg, and release it. The pigeon would fly unerringly straight home, often covering hundreds of miles in a single day, unimpeded by terrain, bandits, or broken bridges. This was a dedicated point-to-point channel, a silent arrow of information shot from the field directly into the commander's hand at home. It was ideal for sending concise tactical updates, the outcome of a battle, the sighting of an enemy force, or a call for reinforcements. Like the beacon, its vocabulary was limited, but its speed and reliability made it an indispensable tool for centuries. Beyond fire and feather, simpler visual codes filled the gaps. Semaphore-like systems using flags, polished shields to flash sunlight, or columns of smoke in specific patterns could convey pre-arranged signals across shorter distances. A garrison on a hilltop might use a sequence of flag movements to warn neighboring forts of an approaching raid. Scouts could relay basic information about an enemy's size or direction using a code of mirrored flashes. These methods were the Empire's peripheral vision, its way of maintaining situational awareness across a broad front without uttering a word. Together, these ancillary systems formed a layered defense of awareness. The beacon chain was the Empire's shout of alarm. The carrier pigeon was its whispered secret from behind enemy lines. The flag signal was its quick glance to a neighboring unit. They lacked the nuance for tax records or legal decrees, but they provided something equally vital, the gift of time. They bought precious hours or days for the slower, more deliberate courier network to spring into action, for legions to be mobilized, for fleets to be launched. They ensured the first news of a crisis was not a detailed report arriving weeks later, but a single, urgent pulse felt across the entire realm in a matter of moments. This reveals a sophisticated understanding of information itself, that not all messages are equal, and that different threats require different velocities of thought. The Empire could now both think deeply with its couriers and react instinctively with its beacons, a combination that made it a far more resilient and terrifyingly responsive organism. The silent runners and swift riders did more than deliver orders. They shaped the very words we use to govern. The infrastructure of imperial thought left a permanent imprint on language and law, structuring administration in ways that outlasted the empires themselves. Consider the simple word post, as in postal service or to post a letter. It originates from the Latin positus, meaning placed or stationed. It directly refers to the horses and men placed at fixed intervals along the Roman roads, the very stations of the Cursus Publicus. Our modern concept of mail is built on a 2,000-year-old idea of strategic placement for relay. This is not a coincidence. It is a fossil of an imperial nervous system preserved in our everyday speech. Beyond vocabulary, these networks hardened crucial legal and diplomatic concepts that still underpin international relations today. The need to protect the courier and his message led to the formalization of official secrecy and the sacred rights of envoys. A messenger bearing the seal of a king or emperor was recognized as an extension of that ruler's person. To harm him or intercept his dispatch was not merely a crime, it was an act of war against the sovereign himself. This idea evolved into the principle of diplomatic immunity, a foundational stone of modern diplomacy that ensures ambassadors can travel and communicate without fear, a direct legacy of the need for unimpeded information flow between powers. The sanctity of the sealed document, first enforced by Roman law with threats of execution for tampering, established early protocols for state secrecy and secure correspondence. The influence of these systems often flowed from one empire to its successors, adapting and enduring. The Mongol Yam, with its demanding efficiency and use of authority tablets, left a profound mark on the administrative machinery of the states that rose in the steppes' shadow. Both the Russian Yamshchik system and the sophisticated Ottoman courier network, the Ulak, drew clear inspiration from the Yam's model of relay stations and prioritized travel. The Ottomans refined it further, integrating it into their complex millet system and using it to manage a diverse empire spanning 3 continents. The blueprint for rapid, official communication proved to be a technology of governance too valuable to discard. Perhaps the most subtle yet powerful legacy is found in the very map of empire. Administrative divisions were rarely arbitrary. They were often designed around the practical logic of the communication routes. A Roman province's size might be determined by how many days' travel it was from the capital, ensuring a governor could be reached within a predictable time frame. Inca territorial organization along the branches of the Quipu Nyan ensured each region was tethered to the network's lifeline. The routes dictated where administrative centers were built, where taxes were collected, and how law was enforced. The network did not just connect pre-existing points, it actively determined where those points of power would be. In this way, the channels of communication sculpted the political geography itself, making the map a physical diagram of information flow. These networks, therefore, did far more than carry messages. They helped write the grammar of imperial rule. They provided the syntax for command, the vocabulary for secrecy, and the punctuation of administrative boundaries. They turned the chaotic idea of distance into a manageable equation of time and stations. The echoes of their logic resonate in our words for mail, in our laws protecting diplomats, and in the very shape of historical regions on a map. They remind us that to govern is to communicate, and the systems we build to connect inevitably become the frameworks through which we control. This raises a final, profound question. As we now live in an age of instant digital connection, what new grammars of power are being written by the networks we take for granted? The swiftest courier carried more than orders, he carried a shared reality. These networks were not just administrative tools, they were the primary broadcast system for the empire's voice, transmitting the cultural and ideological glue that could bind a mosaic of peoples into something resembling a single society. When a new emperor ascended the throne in Rome, the news did not trickle slowly from town to town by merchant gossip. Imperial heralds, using the speed of the Cursus Publicus, would carry the formal proclamation to every major city across the provinces. Within weeks, citizens from Britannia to Syria would hear the same announcement, swear the same oath of loyalty, and witness the same ceremonies. This created a powerful, synchronized moment of political transition experienced by millions simultaneously, reinforcing the idea that they were all subjects of the same, living entity. A military victory against a foreign enemy was not just a tactical success, it was a story to be told. The official dispatch detailing the triumph would be read aloud in forums and agoras, transforming a distant event into a shared point of pride and a testament to the empire's protective power. This rapid dissemination of news helped forge a common historical narrative, a collective memory curated by the state and delivered at the speed of a galloping horse. The same channels proved essential for the spread of unifying ideologies, particularly religion. When the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka embraced the principles of Buddhism in the 3rd century before the Common Era, he faced the monumental task of explaining his profound personal change and new governing philosophy to a vast and diverse populace. His solution was to inscribe his edicts on pillars and rock faces across the subcontinent, but the ideas themselves traveled along the royal roads and trade routes maintained by his administration. Messengers and traveling monks carried the essence of his teachings on non-violence, compassion, and righteous conduct, using the empire's own infrastructure to propagate a message that transcended local deities and customs. Centuries later, a similar pattern unfolded in the Roman world. After Emperor Constantine's pivotal decisions regarding Christianity, the evolving doctrines and official positions of the early church were debated in councils and then disseminated across the empire using the very same roads and relay stations built for legions and tax collectors. Synods could be convened, letters from bishops could circulate, and key theological rulings could reach distant congregations with a speed that helped standardize belief and practice. The network that once carried orders to suppress a cult now carried the tenets of a faith seeking to become universal. This constant flow of official culture had a subtle, cumulative effect on identity. A farmer in Gaul might never see Rome, but he would hear its laws proclaimed in the local forum, see its coinage with the emperor's face, and witness the arrival of officials who all followed the same procedures. His children might learn a few phrases of Latin from soldiers stationed nearby. Over generations, this repeated exposure to the symbols, language, and legal concepts of the metropole created a slow but powerful acculturation. The conquered began to internalize the rhythms and rules of the conqueror, not necessarily out of love for Rome, but because the empire's narrative was the loudest, most consistent story being told. It became the background noise of daily life. The network ensured that the central story was always present, always being updated, and always reinforcing a hierarchy where the capital was the source of all important news and truth. In this way, the communication system did more than suppress rebellion through fear. It worked to preempt rebellion through assimilation. It offered provinces a stake, however small, in the empire's ongoing story. They became an audience and then gradually participants. The ultimate goal was to make someone think of themselves not as a conquered Gaul or a subjected Judean, but as a Roman citizen who happened to live in Gaul or Judea. This was the highest function of the imperial nervous system, to transmit not just commands but a collective consciousness, weaving countless individual minds into the fabric of a single, enduring idea. A network built for speed reshaped the very land it crossed. The relentless demand for fresh horses created an ecological footprint that stretched for miles around every relay station. To maintain a single major route, an empire needed hundreds, even thousands, of animals in constant rotation. Each horse consumed roughly 20 pounds of grain and hay every day, and required extensive pastureland for grazing when not on duty. This demand redirected local agriculture. Farmers who might have grown food for their communities were often compelled to plant fodder crops like barley or oats instead. Their fields transformed into fuel depots for the imperial information machine. Vast tracts of land were set aside as imperial grazing ranges, altering local ecosystems and sometimes displacing traditional land use. The system's hunger was insatiable, turning the landscape itself into a resource to be managed for the sole purpose of keeping messages moving. The roads that carried these messages were monuments of both creation and destruction. Roman engineers famously preferred the straight line, cutting through hills and filling in valleys with breathtaking disregard for the existing terrain. Forests were cleared, streams were diverted, and the natural lay of the land was permanently altered to serve the logic of the grid. This could be devastating for local ecosystems and the communities that depended on them. Yet this very destruction also sowed the seeds of new growth. A well-built imperial road, once completed, became a conduit for more than just couriers. It facilitated local and regional trade, allowing farmers to get their goods to market more easily and merchants to travel more safely. Villages that sprouted near way stations often found new economic life, providing services to travelers or producing goods that could now be shipped further afield. The road was a wound that could, over time, become a scar of connection, embedding the empire's infrastructure into the local economy in complex ways. For the people living along these routes, the imperial network was a double-edged sword. The obligation to support it was a heavy and constant burden. A community near a Roman mancio or a Mongol Yam station faced the Angaria, the compulsory requisition. They had to provide horses, carts, fodder, food, and labor for passing officials and couriers, often with little or no compensation. This could drain a village's resources at a moment's notice, especially if a large imperial entourage came through. Under the Inca mitre system, households owed labor directly to the state, which included maintaining their section of the royal road, weaving bridge cables, or supplying young men as Chasqui runners. This was time and energy taken away from their own fields and families, a direct tax paid in sweat and service to the distant Sapa Inca. Yet this proximity to the empire's pulse also offered rare advantages. A settlement near a busy station became a hub of activity. It gained access to news from across the realm long before isolated villages, a precious commodity in an age of information scarcity. Local artisans could find steady work repairing harnesses, shoes, or carts. Innkeepers and vendors could sell food and supplies to a steady stream of government travelers. The station itself required local staff, from stable hands to cooks, providing paid or obligated employment. In some cases, a clever local leader might even use his position as a station master to gain influence, acting as a crucial intermediary between the imperial system and the surrounding region. The network, therefore, did not just pass through these communities, it metabolized them. It drew in their resources and labor, but it also injected a measure of economic activity and connection into their lives, making them inseparable from the machinery of state. This deep embedding reveals the true nature of these systems. They were not sleek, invisible wires, but massive, living organisms with roots sunk deep into the soil and society. They required entire ecosystems of support, redirecting rivers of grain and reshaping hillsides to feed their need for speed. They created microeconomies of dependency and opportunity in the shadow of their way stations, binding local fates to imperial rhythms. The empire's ability to think in real time was built upon this vast, often unseen foundation of environmental alteration and social obligation. It reminds us that every great leap in connection, ancient or modern, is never free. It is always purchased with changes to the land and the rearrangement of human lives around its relentless demands. The silent stations and worn artifacts speak to us across centuries. Our understanding of these ancient networks is not pulled from thin air, but painstakingly assembled from physical fragments and faded texts, each one a fossilized synapse of a long-vanished mind. Along the old Roman roads, archaeologists have uncovered the stone foundations of mansions, those official way stations. We can walk through their layouts, seeing the stables for fresh horses, the barracks for couriers, and the courtyards where carts were repaired. These ruins are not just old buildings, they are the architectural blueprints for speed, revealing the precise, standardized planning that made the Cursus Publicus a state-run machine. In museums, we can see the actual tools of command, like the rare surviving Paiza, a Mongol tablet of authority. Holding one, you understand its power. It is not a simple piece of metal, but a portable, undeniable decree that could mobilize an empire. High in the Andes, the stone tambos still dot the mountainsides, their strategic placement a silent testament to the Inca calculation of human endurance, each one precisely a runner's sprint from the next. The written record provides the voice for these silent stones. the Theodosian Code, a massive compilation of Roman law from the 5th century, dedicates entire sections to regulating the Cursus Publicus. It spells out who could use it, what they could demand, and the severe penalties for abusing the system. This is not a story, it is the operating manual for the empire's nervous system, revealing how its speed was protected by law. Centuries later, the Venetian traveler Marco Polo provided awe-struck descriptions of the Mongol Yam, detailing the incredible distances covered by riders with their Paizas, his words painting a vivid picture of a communication web that felt like magic to an outsider. For the Inca, the Spanish chroniclers, despite their biases, recorded crucial eyewitness accounts of the Chasqui runners in action and the mysterious Quipus carried by administrators. These texts are often our only window into the living, breathing operation of these networks. Most tantalizing is the evidence we are still learning to read. The Quipu, those bundles of knotted cords, represent one of history's great unsolved puzzles. For decades, they were seen merely as accounting tools, primitive calculators. But ongoing research suggests a far more complex reality. Scholars now recognize that the variety of colors, not types, and chord positions could encode narrative information, perhaps records of history, poetry, or legal agreements. Each Quipu is a three-dimensional document, a tactile language waiting for its Rosetta Stone. Every new insight into their structure is like finding a new piece of the Inca mind, proving that their system of thought was as sophisticated and nuanced as any based on written script. A worn Roman milestone, a gold Mongol Paiza in a display case, a Quipu in a laboratory, these are not just artifacts, they are the scattered pieces of a grand and intricate mosaic. Each one is a direct physical connection to the Imperial will, a tangible remnant of the relentless drive to conquer time and space. They remind us that the story of these networks is not finished. It is still being unearthed, one stone, one knot, one faded line of text at a time. The ancient imperial networks were a form of hardware, a physical internet built long before the digital age. We can see their stone roads and relay stations as the medieval equivalent of fiber optic cables and server farms, a tangible infrastructure designed to carry the data of its time. The protocols that governed them, the Roman diploma, the Mongol Paiza, the Inca runner's cry, functioned like an ancient version of TCP/IP, the set of rules that allows our modern internet to route packets of information. Both systems share a single, timeless imperative to reduce latency. For an emperor, latency was the deadly gap between an event on the frontier and his awareness of it in the capital. For a modern government or corporation, it is the millisecond delay in a financial transaction or a strategic data feed. The core desire is identical: to shrink the distance between perception and command to zero, enabling a central authority to think and act in what feels like real time across any expanse. Our digital networks achieve speeds and data of volumes those ancient engineers could never have dreamed of, transmitting the entire library of Alexandria in a heartbeat. Yet the fundamental political architecture they serve often echoes the past. The drive for a centralized entity, whether a historic empire or a modern state, to maintain instant awareness of its periphery has not changed. Social media platforms and sensor networks provide a constant stream of global sentiment and events, a sensory flood far beyond the simple harvest reports or military dispatches of old. Satellite surveillance offers a god's-eye view that once required 10,000 scouts. This allows for a level of oversight and potential response that would have been the ultimate fantasy of a Roman emperor or a Mongol Khan. The goal remains control through connection, the ability to sense a disturbance, whether social, economic, or military, and to react before it escalates. Recognizing these historical roots offers a crucial perspective. It frames our current digital revolution not as a complete break from history, but as the latest, most intense chapter in a very old story. The human quest to overcome the isolation of distance, to weave separate places into a single, responsive whole, is a constant. The technologies evolve from horseflesh to silicon, from knotted cords to quantum bits, but the underlying impulse persists to build a system that lets a society think as one. This long view asks us to consider what we are building now. If the Roman road and the Mongol Yam were the nervous systems of their age, shaping laws, economies, and identities, what kind of collective mind are we constructing with our own global network, and who will hold the golden Paiza that commands its flow? Yet for all their sophistication, these networks could not break the fundamental laws of their world. They were masterpieces of optimization, but they existed within a cage of physical and political reality, with limitations as defining as their capabilities. The most obvious constraint was the lag of two-way conversation. A governor on a distant frontier could send a swift report to the capital, and the emperor could issue a rapid reply. But the full cycle of query and detailed response still consumed weeks. If the governor's message asked a complex legal question or requested clarification on a tax policy, he would be governing in a state of suspended animation until the answer returned. This meant local officials still had to exercise significant independent judgment, interpreting old orders in new situations. The network accelerated dialogue, but it could not make it instantaneous. The empire could think fast, but it could not have a real-time conversation with its own extremities. The volume of information these systems could carry was also strikingly small by our standards. A Roman courier's satchel held scrolls, not libraries. A Mongol rider might carry a single oral message or a brief written order. An Inca Chasqui sprinted with a Quipu, a brilliant data storage device, but one with finite physical space for knots. These were networks designed for administrative headlines, not encyclopedic detail. They transmitted the emperor's command, the tax quota, the battle outcome, but not the nuanced cultural context, the local gossip, or the detailed maps of a region. The sensory picture they provided to the central authority was sharp in focus but narrow in frame. The empire's mind was well informed, but its knowledge was highly curated and compressed. A more practical, everyday limitation was the last-mile problem. The imperial highway might end at a provincial capital, and the Yam station might be a day's ride from a nomadic camp. Getting the scroll from the final relay point into the specific hands of a local magistrate or chieftain often relied on slower, less reliable local systems. A message could fly across a continent in days, only to languish for a week in a regional governor's anteroom, or depend on a local boy on a donkey to complete its journey. The final link in the chain was often the weakest, a reminder that engineering a continent-spanning system was one thing, but penetrating every village and valley was another challenge entirely. Most critically, these networks were not engines of conquest, they were instruments of control. They were a symptom of peak imperial power, not a tool for acquiring it. A state needed to already be wealthy, stable, and administratively advanced to fund and maintain such a system. You could not build a Roman road or a chain of Yam stations through territory you did not firmly hold. The network required peace along its routes, loyalty from its station masters, and a steady flow of resources from a productive treasury. In times of civil war, invasion, or economic collapse, the system was often the first thing to fracture. Stations would be abandoned, horses requisitioned for battle, and roads left in disrepair. The nervous system was exquisitely sensitive, and it could not function in a body racked by convulsions. Its very existence signaled that an empire had achieved a level of internal order and resource surplus that was the envy of the world, but its fragility revealed how much that achievement depended on constant, careful maintenance. Understanding these limits does not diminish their achievement, it deepens it. It places their brilliance within a real historical context where stone, sinew, and human will pushed against the hard boundaries of geography, physics, and politics. They show us empires operating at the very edge of what was technologically possible for their age, creating miracles of connection with the tools they had. And in doing so, they hold up a mirror to our own networks, inviting us to ask what profound, and perhaps invisible, limits might one day define the systems we take for granted. The lone runner collapses at the city gates, gasping a single word before his heart gives out. This iconic image from the legend of Phadippides at Marathon is more than a story of athletic heroism. It is a cultural memory of the messenger's ultimate duty. Long before empires built their relay networks, societies understood that the man who carried the word carried the fate of the community. In the Greek tale, the runner's desperate sprint from the battlefield to Athens was a one-man, life-or-death communication system. He was the only link between victory and catastrophic misunderstanding. His success meant salvation. His failure would have meant the city's abandonment and capture. This archetype, the messenger who stakes everything on speed and endurance, echoes through the folklore of many cultures, revealing how deeply these figures were woven into the collective imagination of safety and survival. Persian chronicles celebrated not just the speed of the royal courier, but his unshakable loyalty. Stories were told of messengers who, attacked by bandits or wild animals, would swallow the written dispatch to protect its contents, choosing a personal fate over the betrayal of the king's sealed word. In these narratives, the courier transcends being a mere employee. He becomes a guardian of royal authority itself, a living symbol of the trust required to keep an empire coherent. His reliability was a point of cultural pride, a testament to the power of the state to command such perfect service. These glorified accounts, whether fully factual or embellished, served a vital purpose. They established the ideal. They broadcast the expectation that the empire's will was so sacred that its human vessels should be prepared for any sacrifice. The dark shadow of this ideal was a terrifying reality. For these ancient systems, the penalty for failure was often absolute. Historical records and stories from Rome, China, and the steppe empires are clear. A messenger who lost his dispatch, who arrived too late with critical news, or who was found to have betrayed his trust, faced the gravest consequences. This was not considered cruelty, but a brutal necessity of systems built on absolute reliability. If the information in that satchel was worth more than a single life, which it often was when it concerned rebellions or invasions, then the life of the man who failed to deliver it was forfeit. This harsh equation placed the individual courier under almost unimaginable pressure. He was not just racing against time, he was racing against the specter of a state's wrath. Every muddy road, every swollen river, every strange sound in a forest pass was not just an obstacle, but a potential death sentence if it caused delay. This tension between glorified duty and dreadful consequence highlights the profound human drama at the core of the logistical machine. We see the empire's nervous system not as an abstract network, but as a chain of individual hearts and minds, each one bearing a crushing weight. The Chasqui runner feeling his lungs burn in the thin mountain air, the Mongol rider pushing his fifth horse of the day through a blizzard, the Roman Veridarius nursing blisters as he changed mounts yet again, all of them knew the stakes. They were the fragile biological components in an otherwise engineered system. A snapped tendon, a misplaced Paiza, a moment of doubt, and the entire pulse of information could stop with them. These myths and harsh histories force us to listen for the human breath within the empire's grand design. They remind us that the real-time capability of a civilization was purchased not just with gold and stone, but with the courage, fear, and sometimes the lives of the individuals who chose or were compelled to become the vessels for its most urgent thoughts. The folklore preserves their ghostly echo, the sound of running feet on a dusty road, carrying the hopes and terrors of an age that knew speed was the difference between a realm that lived and one that was already forgotten. The true test of an empire's nervous system came not in peace but in panic. Let us reconstruct a moment of crisis, a provincial rebellion on the fringes of the Roman world, to watch the communication web snap to life. It begins not with a battle but with a suspicion. A governor in the province of Gallia Lugdunensis notices unsettling patterns. Local nobles are meeting in secret. The usual tax shipments are delayed under thin excuses. A trusted informant whispers of weapons being stockpiled in a forest shrine. This is not yet open war, it is a tremor, a faint signal of coming upheaval. The governor's first and most critical decision is not military, it is informational. He must alert Rome, and he must do it faster than the plotters can solidify their plans. He summons his fastest Veridarius, hands him a sealed scroll detailing the intelligence, and sends him galloping toward the nearest mutatio on the Great Roman Road. The race against the rebellion has begun. That scroll now becomes the most important object in the province. Carried by the courier, it flies south, changing horses every 8 miles, passing from rider to rider in a continuous sprint. It travels day and night, crossing rivers on stone bridges, climbing mountain passes on paved inclines. Within a week, a journey that would take a merchant caravan over a month, the dispatch is in Rome. It lands on the desk of a palace secretary, who breaks the imperial seal and delivers it directly to the emperor and his concilium, his advisory council. The distant tremor is now felt in the very heart of the empire. This is the network's first function, transforming a local whisper into a central fact. The council room becomes a war room. Maps are unrolled, not decorative charts, but practical diagrams of roads, legionary fortresses, and supply depots, all information compiled and updated by previous dispatches carried on this same network. They debate the report. Is this a true rebellion or merely local unrest? Which legions are closest? Which allied tribes in the region remain loyal, and which might be swayed? Decisions crystallize into commands, and the network now operates in reverse, radiating the empire's will outward. Multiple couriers depart Rome simultaneously, each with a specific task. One rides northwest to the commander of the nearest loyal legion, perhaps in Germania Superior, with orders to mobilize and march. Another speeds to a trusted client king in a neighboring region, carrying a personal appeal from the emperor and promises of reward for military support. A third is dispatched directly back to the governor in Gallia Lugdunensis, not with troops but with authority, granting him emergency powers to raise local auxiliaries and seize the property of known conspirators. A fourth might carry a very different kind of message, a propaganda decree to be read in the forums of the unstable province, offering amnesty to minor participants while promising divine and imperial wrath upon the ringleaders. The network allows for a multifaceted response, military, diplomatic, administrative, and psychological, all launched in coordinated sequence. Meanwhile, the original web of awareness continues to function. As the loyal legion marches, its commander sends regular updates back to Rome via the same relay stations, reporting his progress and any fresh intelligence from the field. The governor sends follow-up dispatches, confirming the rebellion is now open or, in a best-case scenario, reporting that the swift show of force has caused the conspiracy to collapse. The emperor, sitting in the Palatine Hill, receives these pulses of information, allowing him to adjust his strategy in near real time. He can redirect reinforcements, authorize funds from the provincial treasury, or call off the mobilization if the crisis abates. The rebellion is no longer an isolated fire in a remote forest. It is a contained incident on an imperial map, managed by a system that connects perception to decision and decision to action with breathtaking efficiency. This is how the communication web turned information into power. It enabled the empire not merely to learn of a threat, but to think its way through the response, coordinating the muscles of the state across hundreds of miles with the precision of a single mind directing a single body. For 2,000 years, the fastest a thought could travel was the speed of a horse or a runner's heart. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, that ancient limit was broken not by a faster animal, but by a silent spark. The electric telegraph did not move a physical object from one place to another. It moved the message itself, divorcing information from the constraints of geography and flesh for the very first time. A dispatch that would have taken a Roman courier weeks or a Mongol rider days could now cross a continent in minutes. This was not an improvement on the old system. It was a complete reinvention of what communication could be. The telegraph wire became the new imperial nerve, and it made the meticulously maintained relay stations and sprinting messengers of the past look like elegant, but suddenly ancient curiosities. The true revolution was the separation of speed from travel. Before the telegraph, if you wanted a message to go faster, you had to make the horse run harder or build a straighter road. The information was locked inside a moving body. The telegraph changed the fundamental equation. It turned language into electrical impulses that raced along a copper wire at nearly the speed of light. The distance between London and Calcutta became irrelevant to the transmission time. The delay was in the human operators tapping the keys, not in the journey. This leap was so profound it altered the basic rhythm of governance and commerce. Stock markets could now synchronize across oceans, creating a truly global financial pulse. Military commanders could receive orders from their capitals while a battle was still unfolding, collapsing the strategic lag that had defined warfare since the beginning of history. The world shrank not over generations, but in the span of a single lifetime. This new nervous system was soon paired with a transformation of the empire's circulatory system. The railway and the steamship did for physical movement what the telegraph did for information. They accelerated it by an order of magnitude. A legion that once marched 20 miles a day could now be transported 200 miles by rail in the same time. Supplies, administrators, and settlers could flow into territories with a speed and volume that would have been unimaginable to the builders of the Nyan or the Cursus Publicus. The steamship made ocean crossings predictable and fast, taming the winds and currents that had always dictated the pace of intercontinental connection. These technologies worked in concert, the telegraph wires often running alongside the railroad tracks, creating a dual channel of instant command and rapid physical response. An empire could now both think and move with a velocity that left older models of power stranded in the past. This seismic shift presented the ultimate test for the empires that had mastered the old ways. Some, like Great Britain, eagerly wove the telegraph and the railway into the fabric of their global dominion, using them to administer India, manage African colonies, and coordinate a navy that ruled the waves. The new tools extended their reach and tightened their control, creating a Victorian web of steel and wire that was the logical, terrifying evolution of the Roman road network. But other traditional powers faltered. The Qing dynasty in China and later the Ottoman Empire were often slow to adopt and integrate these technologies on a systemic level. They viewed them as foreign novelties or threats to existing social and military hierarchies. This hesitation created a critical vulnerability. An empire with a telegraph could mobilize and coordinate while its rival was still relying on messengers. The gap in decision-making speed became a gap in survival. The lesson was stark: mastery of one era's communication technology guaranteed nothing in the next. The very systems that had once been the source of supreme advantage could become anchors of obsolescence if the culture of power failed to adapt. The reign of the horse, the runner, and the knotted cord was over. Their networks, which had once felt like miracles of human ingenuity, were quietly abandoned, their stone stations reclaimed by the earth, their grassy trails fading into the landscape. They had solved the problem of their age with breathtaking elegance, but they were bound to the physics of a world where to send a word, you had to send a thing. The spark in the wire liberated the word, setting it free to fly at the speed of thought itself. This transition marks one of the great divides in human history, the moment we stopped building networks to conquer distance and began building them to conquer time. And in that new, instantaneous world, the nature of empire and the meaning of connection would have to be reinvented all over again. The stone-paved roads and mountain trails have long since fallen silent. Yet the legacy of these networks is not found in ruins, but in a pattern of thought that has outlived every empire that first traced it onto the landscape. These systems were the world's first great information technology, a physical internet built with the materials of their age. They proved that the true architecture of power is not a palace or a fortress, but a channel, a way to make a distant whisper audible in the center of command. The empires that mastered this art did more than move messages. They engineered a new kind of political reality, one where a single will could feel the heartbeat of a continent. This ability to think in real time was the ultimate competitive advantage, the invisible thread that could weave a patchwork of tribes and territories into something resembling a unified mind. Without these networks, the grand titles of emperor or khan would have been empty, their commands lost in the vastness they claimed to rule. The roads, the runners, and the relay stations were the tangible expression of a central nervous system, the biological metaphor made stunningly real. They turned geography from an enemy into an ally, transforming the very distances that threatened to tear an empire apart into the pathways that held it together. In this light, history's greatest states appear not as collections of land, but as living, thinking organisms, their borders defined less by mountains and rivers than by the reach of their communication. The speed of their thought determined the pace of their governance, the efficiency of their economy, and the loyalty of their subjects. To study these networks is to study the anatomy of empire itself, to see the skeleton of stone and the sinew of human effort that gave a civilization its reflexes. As we scroll through instant news feeds and send messages across the globe in a blink, we are living within the latest, most dazzling iteration of this ancient human project. The copper wires and fiber optic cables that pulse beneath our feet and oceans are the direct descendants of the Roman via and the Inca Quipu Nyan. Our satellites blinking in the void are the spiritual successors to the fire beacons that once flashed from hilltop to hilltop. The medium has been dematerialized, the speed has become instantaneous, but the core imperative remains unchanged: to collapse distance, to share awareness, and to enable a collective will. This long arc of history invites a quiet reflection. Every tool we build to connect ourselves also reshapes the nature of power and community. The empires of the past used their networks to centralize control, to project authority, and to cultivate a shared identity. Our digital networks hold that same potential for both unification and control, for enlightenment and manipulation. Understanding where these systems came from allows us to see our own world with clearer eyes, to recognize the age-old patterns playing out at light speed. It asks us to consider who, in our own time, holds the golden Paiza, the symbol that commands the flow of information, and to what end that flow is directed. The journey from the courier's pounding heart to the silent flight of a data packet is the story of humanity's relentless drive to overcome isolation. It is a story that continues with every click, every call, every connected moment. If exploring the hidden systems that built our world changes how you see the one we live in now, consider joining us for more journeys into the past that quietly shapes our present.